I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join us as we quest for the awe and wonder of knowing we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. Celebrated writer Anne Fadiman has an omnivorous curiosity about the world. Inquisitiveness fuels every part of her latest book, Frog and Other Essays. One section of this collection transports the reader all the way to Antarctica to witness how a group of explorers, during endless nights of polar winter there more than a century ago, kept their spirits up by performing theater and even publishing a newspaper. In another essay, we're off to Cape Cod for Fadiman's account of a tiny 14-year-old girl sailing solo who survives a boat race in gale force winds, outlasting even many adult competitors to finish bloodied but unbowed, as they say. Then, drawing on past experience as a journalist, Anne Fadiman shares her personal reflections on the second longest solar eclipse of the millennium, something she witnessed firsthand from the hot Saharan sands of Mauritania in 1973. I connected with Anne Fadiman via internet call, and our conversation was as wide-ranging as her books are. She's the kind of person you can sit down with, never knowing where you'll go, but you're always grateful afterwards that you got to take that ride. With apologies to the frog, who became the title for her new collection of essays, he won't be part of our episode. Let me take you along on a journey that will start with those polar explorers. You've likely heard of Sir Ernest Shackleton and maybe of his comrade, Robert Falcon Scott. Scott was captain of this particular expedition in 1902 in one of the last three-masted wooden boats built in the UK. Now, Anne knows so much about Captain Scott, his crew, even their cargo, which, by the way, included 5,000 pounds of marmalade, as I learned from her, that reading this account, I began to suspect that Anne is downright obsessed with Antarctica.
Yes, it is an obsession. You're absolutely right. I have what used to be a single shelf and is now a rather appalling number of shelves about Arctic and Antarctic exploration. Robert Falcon Scott went to the Antarctic on a couple of expeditions in the early 20th century and did eventually make the South Pole, only to find that he'd already been beaten there by the Norwegians.
Which fact leads me to believe that your obsession with the story of this expedition in particular, it just doesn't hinge on all the old ideals of conquest and bravery. I seem to think that you're more interested in themes like ingenuity and human foibles and passions among these explorers, and I would quickly point to the example of Edward Wilson, whom you write about. This Wilson was an ornithologist on the expedition, and I'll quickly interject here that, like Scott and others, unfortunately he did not return. He froze to death. But the whole bit you write about, this Wilson acting in the role of a mama penguin by regurgitating seal meat, or at least chewing it up for a baby bird. Now, I can't say that I've just never chewed on seal meat. I just don't know what to say.
Me neither. But you have now vicariously. So Edward Wilson is my absolute favorite from that group of Antarctic explorers. Once, when he was in Antarctica, he had a pet baby penguin, and he would arise several times during the night and pre-chew seal meat in order to feed the baby penguin. Now, that is certainly a form of love. And when I read that about him, I thought, I really understand this person. And then I read a long, out-of-print book about him that said that when he collected eggs as a boy growing up in rural England, that he would never take the whole clutch of eggs. He would often just take one out of a larger clutch because he didn't want the mother bird to come back to her nest and find that all of her eggs were gone. He wished to kiss the eggs. He would feel so strongly. And I thought, this is someone who really, really connects with the natural world in the most beautiful way. And I can do so through him. He said that it was hard to explain how you could love a bird so much that you would kiss every egg in a nest and pray for those eggs. Now, that's a kind of direct connection to nature that I find beautiful and moving. It's that level of rich detail that makes me feel I know Edward Wilson. I can call it a relationship, even though he's been dead for a really long time. He knows nothing about me, but I know him. I really feel that if we were to meet, we could start a conversation immediately because I know things that are beyond his standard biography. I know the kinds of intimate details that one might know about a friend. But what I love about reading letters and journals by these guys is the extreme sense of camaraderie they felt with each other and their appreciation of the beauty of the ice and the snow and the crevasses and the mountains and the penguins that surrounded them. I love the outdoors and have spent a lot of time in my life in the outdoors, and I'm also a journalist. And I got particularly obsessed with a periodical called the South Polar Times, which was produced in an edition of one on both of Scott's expeditions, first on shipboard and then in the hut where they overwintered.
Let me pause just a moment here to emphasize that overwintering in the Antarctic is an extreme physical and mental challenge. Some sailors went mad in this bleak time of year. I mean, when your ship is stuck in the ice for months of darkness, keeping your men's spirits up is just as important as feeding them. Thus, the importance of diversions like the South Polar Times, produced in a single edition, as Anne said.
It was hand-typed and hand-illustrated and then passed around by the men. All of the contributions had pseudonyms. Many of them were very funny. The illustrations by Edward Wilson were gorgeous. He called his illustrations of birds attempts to praise God. And I contrasted the infinite preciousness of those editions of one. It was the only periodical in Antarctica, and it had the smallest circulation of any periodical in the world. And yet, compared to any periodicals with circulations of millions upon millions, I don't think that any other periodical was more appreciated than the South Polar Times, which was published only during the months when there was no sun and was designed essentially, as Scott said, to light us up from within when there's no light without. When I read the South Polar Times, I am there in the hut, and all of the years, decades, more than a century between me and them really do start to fade. I love that feeling.
So let me get this right. You have Antarctic explorers. They come from Britain, and I meet so many British people who are so well educated and so articulate. And it doesn't surprise me, frankly, that an expedition from Great Britain to Antarctica would be replete with some literate folk who can write and write extremely well. But it seems a little odd, though. Nowadays, I wouldn't expect anybody to strike up a newspaper in such a remote location. Maybe that's a judgment on my part that's misplaced, but it's kind of weird that a group would do this.
Well, if you knew this group, you wouldn't think it was weird. They also had a huge library. They had some musical instruments. They had costumes. They put on plays. A lot of previous expeditions to the Antarctic and also the Arctic had real psychological problems during the months when there was no sun. And you couldn't explore during those months, so you were just stuck, either iced in on a ship or freezing in a hut that you'd build. And so how to keep people's spirits up? Everybody could contribute. So whether you were one of the leaders or whether you were one of the, humble seamen, you were permitted to try to contribute, but it was pretty competitive. Only the best stuff got in. And also in the evenings during these dark months, they would have lectures. They called it the Universitas Antarcticas. The geologist would talk about Antarctic geology, but they also talked about all kinds of other subjects. It was the notion that keeping people intellectually on their toes would prevent their spirits from sinking. And I think it absolutely worked.
Can you identify with that on any kind of personal level where you've been in a situation of deprivation of maybe I don't know if it's a remote location or isolation, or your wings are clipped a little, or you don't have what you need around you to preoccupy yourself and you're kind of stuck and you have to figure out a world for the mind, a world for the heart, a world for the soul without being able to reach out and just grab what's there?
Well, don't you think that's what the pandemic was for so many of us? I had a wonderful world because for the first time in years, my 2 adult children were both with us for 5.5 months. That was fantastic. But our social world was really limited, but our intellectual world wasn't limited. We read, we watched Netflix together, we talked about what we had read. We felt the distance between us and other people dissolve.
Besides her husband and 2 children, Anne's pod, as many people called it back then, the small, tightly circumscribed group of people that you would actually socialize with in person. Well, for Anne, her pod also included her mother-in-law, which made for some never-to-be-forgotten times in the waning years of the elderly woman's life.
One very important person in our family group was my husband's mother, no longer alive, who lived in a nearby retirement community. And our son would pick her up several times a week, and she would come to our house, and we would play music. She had at one point been a guitar teacher, and our son is now a professional musician. My husband has a really beautiful voice, and, I accompany them on the recorder at approximately 3rd grade level, but everybody else in the family is pretty darn musical. And my mother-in-law was in the very first stages of dementia, and there was a lot that she could no longer do, including play the guitar, but she could still play the harmonica. And it was as if all of her cognitive problems just disappeared. And I have such happy memories of those musical evenings during the pandemic. Also, jumping forward a few years, another time when she was isolated, but when music de-isolated her in the later stages of her Alzheimer's, when she was in a memory care unit. Whenever my husband and I would visit her, George would bring a guitar and we'd sing. And even though she couldn't really put together a coherent full sentence when she spoke, she could remember lyrics and she could still sing. Once she simply picked up a harmonica, which we'd brought just as almost a prop. We didn't think she could still play it, and just started playing Amazing Grace. And it was really a moment of amazing grace. It was as if on some sort of soul level, she remembered the things that would be most useful to her at the moment, and they weren't words, they were music.
Physical or geographical isolation, be it in Antarctica on an expedition or in quarantine during COVID, well, that can bring one variety of loneliness. Feeling different from others or somehow overlooked as a child of famous parents, well, that can bring a certain sense of separateness. And it happens to be something author Anne Fadiman has dealt with herself. So dealing with famous parents, that's one of many compelling themes in her new book, Frog and Other Essays. We touched on it in the course of our conversation, and we'll go there next, here on Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. I'd like to introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show, hosted by comedian, believer, and single mother Lisa Valentine Clark. The Lisa Show delves into most any challenge that meets us in the course of our lives, especially challenges in the realm of human relationships, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, or social issues. Lisa and her council of moms are willing to tackle it. Figuring life out is vexing enough without losing an ability to laugh or cry together or just plain talk things through. The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
In my new book, one of the essays is about Hartley Coleridge. He was born in 1796, and nobody else has heard of him. Everybody's heard of his father, who was with Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley, one of the most famous in a group of English early 19th century poets called the Romantics. The father was famous, the son was not.
Hartley, you may have deduced, was a son of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And Fadiman has a lot of empathy for the fix Hartley was in with a famous father, given that both her parents were highly successful writers in their own day. Her mother, Anna Lee, was a World War II correspondent for Time magazine and co-author of a book about the Chinese Civil War. Anne's father, Clifton, was host of a popular radio quiz show called Information Please, which began airing in 1938 and ran until 1951. Now, broadcasting was clearly the thing that made him a household name, possibly even more popular in his own time than Jeopardy's Alex Trebek was in our time. But Clifton Fadiman's renown in more serious circles was as an editor and literary critic.
My parents were both writers, and that was a tremendous advantage to me in some ways. And I got to grow up with a lot of books and the knowledge that you could actually make a living by writing. There were also disadvantages because my parents were both well known, and I felt that whatever I did had already been done better by them. And so I was very interested to start reading everything I could, both the poetry and the letters of Hartley Coleridge, to see how he had dealt with being the son of arguably one of the two most famous poets in the world at the time, the other one being Wordsworth, who was a friend of the family and who was always around too. And he published just one book of poems in his life, and one of the reviewers said something like, he has inherited some of his father's mantle of genius, but the oakling always withers beneath the shadow of the oak. My essay is called The Oakling and the Oak, and I'm really interested in oaklings. I am, of course, an oakling myself. So what made me an oakling thrive, feel able to write, and what made Hartley fail, become a sad alcoholic living in a remote cottage in the Lake District that I've been to and still feels very remote. I think he could have published more if he had wished to. He left some very good work behind that his brother gathered and published after he died. It was that he felt he had failed. He'd been fired from an academic job that he probably wouldn't have enjoyed. And so it was probably good that he didn't spend his life at Oxford. But he was so surrounded by the aura of failure that he could never live up to his father's genius that I think he felt paralyzed. What he needed was perhaps modern psychotherapy to say, you know, your father is a great poet, but he also in some ways isn't a really great father, and he kind of abandoned the family, and he kind of left you with a lot of burdens.
Samuel Coleridge, you see, never lived with his wife and children after Hartley was 7 years old. His criticism of his son was lifelong and relentless, with demoralizing letters sent from far afield that took Hartley to task for a litany of alleged shortcomings. Anne's regard for Hartley, in light of this ill treatment, sounds so tender, really.
You know, you're really talented too, and what can we do to make you more self-confident? I think that's what Hartley needed.
So if there's a comparison at all then just to be made between his circumstances and yours, with you growing up with some parents of note and who've made their stamp on the world in a rather conspicuous way, if there's a comparison to be made there, how'd you do it? How'd you keep your wits about you and your sense of self?
I was really lucky that I didn't have Samuel Taylor Coleridge as a parent. I mean, not only did he essentially leave the family, but he was just a hectoring, stern, critical father who, in my view, was constantly projecting his own flaws, like procrastination, onto his son. He was constantly telling his son not to do the things that he himself was doing. My parents weren't at all like that. They were extremely supportive, never criticized my writing. It was as if they knew that that just wasn't their role. And also, when I actually grew up and started publishing, they didn't read my stuff until it was published. And then they always praised it. If they had any criticisms, they kept them to themselves. I didn't want their feedback while anything was in progress because I needed to feel that I had done everything entirely by myself. I think that they understood that that was the right way to go. So I felt that they were nothing but supportive, probably overly supportive, because that's what parents are for. Parents are around to tell their children that they're wonderful. Of course, they're also around to guide us and lead us and keep us out of trouble and so on. But, they're there maybe not to be as objectively critical in their feedback as, let's say, our teachers. So I was able to be an oakling who I think did not wither beneath the shadow of my own two rather large oaks.
You have written so eloquently, and I've heard you speak in public about your father in his later years, re-engaging with life. He got to be in his older years and must have been just terribly demoralized, depressed, suicidal, and then that all changed.
Yeah, so my father, Clifton Fadiman, was a critic and essayist, worked in various ways in the literary world until he was 94, just a few months before he died. But the period that you were alluding to was maybe the most surprising period in his life. He lost almost all of his sight when he was in his late 80s to acute retinal necrosis, and within a week, he went from being able to read tiny type in the Encyclopedia Britannica to not being able to see the E at the top of an eye chart. He could see light and dark and large shapes, and that was it. And there was nothing to be done. He and my mother were living in Florida at the time, and I had taken him to the other side of Florida, to Miami, to go to an eye hospital, and I spent the night with him in his room after he had been told that he would never regain his sight, that the best that could be done was to help him retain the very low vision that he had. He would never read again, and because his entire life for more than 80 years had revolved around reading or writing, he felt it was over, and he asked me whether I would help him commit suicide. I said, make me a promise that you'll try everything you possibly can to adapt for 6 months, and then we'll talk again. And so I didn't say that I'd help him in 6 months, but I didn't say that I wouldn't help him. And so, of course, I was just on the edge of my chair for those 6 months. But one of the things that he did to keep his promise was that he went to a kind of a day program in a nearby city near where he lived in Fort Myers for adults who had recently lost all or most of their vision. And they learned to do things like, how do you put the toothpaste on a toothbrush, and how do you open a milk carton, and how do you make sure that your socks match, and things like that. I mean, he already had my mother to sort of take care of him, but seeing that other people were worse off than he, Some were completely blind, and many were really financially stressed. Many had worse other physical problems, but also regaining some of his confidence because the leader of the group decided that he should lead a little talk group in every session, and he assigned homework. People had to listen to Larry King on the radio, and he would conduct, a little discussion group. He had been a radio host, sort of like being a podcast host in his younger days. And so he was kind of back in the saddle. After he finished that program, he never brought up suicide again. And he learned how to listen to recorded books, and he learned how to dictate to a part-time secretary. He learned how to do all kinds of things, and to have a learning curve at such a late age was exciting to him. I think he really felt proud. He'd never served in either war. He'd been too young for World War I and too old for World War II, and he'd always thought of himself as a very unbrave person, and I think he decided that that wasn't actually true. I would say that those latter years with his very, very limited vision ended up being among the happiest of his life.
To talk about bravery and to think about his restrictions, limitations because of his loss of his vision, that just takes me right back to Antarctica and the limitations, the restrictions, the quarantine concept that we were talking about earlier. It's so interesting to me that a vibrant life can be found when we are contained within limits that most of us would want to doff and be done with.
The idea that restrictions can be liberating is profound and definitely not new. It's not that my father said, "Oh, it's really great to be blind. I'm so glad." But nonetheless, that he did find a kind of freedom because of the restriction, not just in spite of it. Wordsworth had a wonderful sonnet about that called Nuns Fret Not at Their Convent's Narrow Room. And he said, well, nuns don't find it a problem that the little cell that they live in their convent is so small. They need to have that restriction in order to have access to the largest thing ever, the mind of God. And he said bees, sometimes they could fly high up on the tops of mountains, but they choose to dwell inside a small flower. And he ultimately said, and that's how I feel about sonnets, what he called the sonnet's scanty plot of ground, that it's only 14 lines. It's not going to be 15. It has very strict meter, but that he could do something because of those limitations and not in spite of them. And I think that's what the pandemic was, despite the fact that it was a tragedy for many people. For some lucky people like my immediate family, the restrictions turned out to be in some ways a liberation.
Anne obviously has a lot of admiration for Clifton Fadiman and the vigor with which he overcame his limitations. In her latest book, she also writes about another inspiration in her life, a much younger person. This was a former student of hers at Yale, where Anne is writer-in-residence and English professor. The name of this chapter is Yes to Everything. And don't worry, it's not an admonition to become overcommitted. Instead, it's a celebration of embracing all the best that life has to offer. That's the next turn in this Constant Wonder conversation with Anne Fadiman. I'm Marcus Smith. Embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed and host Sam Payne. It's one of many shows from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Wrap yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. You'll hear live studio audiences taking immense delight in a broad tapestry of tales, some humorous, others poignantly reflective. The Appleseed is always a family-friendly experience. It sparks imagination creative enough to make fiction feel like fact and bring real-life events back to life. The Appleseed. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. Talk for a little bit about a beautiful soul named Marina Keegan, I believe was her last name, one of your students. There's a short essay at the conclusion of your new book, Frog, about the impact of this person on not just you, but so many people around her. Died in a car crash 5 days after graduation. The title, Yes to Everything, comes from Marina. Tell us about this person.
Marina was a student of mine in a class called Writing About Oneself, and she wrote about herself really beautifully. And of course, most of the work written in my classes never gets seen by anyone except the other students in the class. But after Marina died, her parents and I gathered her work, both nonfiction and fiction, from the hard drive of the laptop that itself was completely mangled in the completely mangled car in the accident that had killed her. The hard drive was intact. And so now millions of people have been able to read Marina's words. She was an extraordinary writer. I often wonder about what she would be doing now. She's almost exactly the same age as my daughter, who graduated from college the same week that Marina did in 2012. Yes to Everything was Marina's response to a classmate, and he was a teaching assistant in an English class, and he'd written to Marina saying, your essays from Writing About Oneself are so incredible. Could I use them in my class? Could I use this? Could I use this? Could I use this? And she wrote back, yes to everything. And that was Marina's attitude toward life and to people and to writing and to everything she did. She had an impossibly full schedule at Yale, her senior year, including spending a whole day every week going to New York City from New Haven and interning at the Paris Review. She had a zillion extracurriculars, but she also, on her own, was writing enough that we didn't necessarily know it, to fill an entire book after she died. So that yes to everything is not something I'm always able to do myself, but I think about it a lot because I feel that my life would be richer if I were able to emulate Marina a little bit more. And I miss her enormously.
You've written about an event in her life, and you weren't even there, but her parents, I guess, must have related this to you. And it really displays her character and her tenacity and her spunk. And it's the boat race.
Yeah. So Marina was nothing if not resilient. Her father once, after her death, told me about a sailing race that she'd been part of in Cape Cod when she was 14. She weighed less than 100 pounds, and even though this was a race that was going to have a lot of adults, she hoped that she could win if conditions were right. It's like having a very light jockey on a horse. In good conditions, the lighter you are, the less drag there is on the boat. But the conditions were actually terrible, and there were incredibly high winds, and all the other kids dropped out, and all the other women dropped out. And her sailboat ended up capsizing again and again and again. And she would have to pull the sail out of the water and rate the boat again and again and again. And she got just completely drenched. And instead of winning, she came in second to last. And her hands were bloody from gripping the lines. But she did not give up. And when she came in, there was just incredulous applause at this tiny 14-year-old girl had made it through the race. So her goal changed from being able to win to being able to finish, and she didn't get to finish her life, but I think she won in some ways. I wish she could see the response that her book has gotten. But that resilience is what always made me know that she would succeed as a writer. I've had all too many students who were incredibly talented, but they weren't resilient. And writing is just a series of rejection after rejection after rejection. Your boat just keeps going down in the storm, and you have to get it all the way back up again, and you're getting wetter and wetter, and your hands are getting bloodier and bloodier. But you have to keep going through failure after failure to succeed as a writer. So many of my students simply couldn't deal with that many failures. If they'd been more resilient, they would now be well-known writers, but they weren't like Marina.
There's a preeminent psychologist, Dacher Keltner, who has studied awe for a couple of decades plus, and he has different categories of experience that he says are conducive to the experience of awe and wonder. And one of those categories is moral beauty. He's sort of quantified it, that more people feel a sense of awe when they witness moral beauty in others around them than even in nature or in music or in any other category. It's so beautiful to think about the inexplicable, ineffable aspect of a human being that manifests itself in that kind of resilience.
I'd like to give one more example of moral beauty from right after Marina's death. Her very beloved boyfriend had been at the wheel, and he hadn't been drinking and he hadn't been using drugs. He fell asleep at the wheel while driving her from brunch with her grandmother to her father's birthday party. He was hardly injured, and she died immediately. And I feel that her parents exhibited moral beauty. I've never heard that phrase before, but I would definitely apply it to their response. They invited her boyfriend over to their house. They hugged him, and they wrote a letter asking the charges of vehicular homicide be dropped. And they actually accompanied him, along with his parents, to the court. And the charges were dropped. They went for a long walk with him on the beach in Cape Cod, talked with him, and told him to keep on living his life, that Marina had loved him very much, and they knew that the accident was unintentional, and that they knew how great his pain was, and that she would have wanted him not to blame himself and to keep on going. That response on the part of parents grieving beyond belief, it was a kind of soul or heart courage and beauty that makes me tear up even now when I think about it.
It may be impossible, literally speaking, for anyone to say yes to everything. Well, Anne Fadiman conveys a desire to say yes to more. But I won't shy away from saying that this yes to everything principle, well, that is with very high probability something that Anne understood and had already put into practice long before she met Marina.
In 1986, I went to New Zealand with a close platonic friend who's still a close friend named Charlie. We were in the Tasman Saddle Hut and realized that if we got up in the middle of the night and went out to the glacier about a mile from the hut, that we might have a perfect view of Halley's Comet, which was more visible in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Comes around every 76 years, so this might be our only chance. We got up at 1 o'clock in the morning and we roped up and we put on our crampons. We were reasonably well-versed in mountaineering ourselves, but we had a mountaineering guide with us who knew the glacier well. So it's the three of us. And it was pitch darkness at first, but the stars reflected in the glacier. And we got to a col, a little area with a steep drop-off on both sides. And we had a great view of the northern horizon. And we spread out our sleeping bags on the snow and we looked up. There, near the northern horizon, was Halley's Comet. This little sort of dot matrix stippled thing, not giant, not dramatic, but very obviously not a constellation, not a meteor. And it was just the most amazing experience. We just lay there together, the three of us, in silence, in our sleeping bags on the glacier, feeling sort of dizzy. It was almost impossible to tell whether the comet was above us or we were above the comet. We were all spinning in space together.
What makes those moments rare, I wonder? I mean, I'm just thinking about oftentimes awe is talked about in terms of our impressions or our emotions that come with novelty or with rarity. And many people can talk about chasing the total solar eclipse and being within the zone of totality and what happens to them. You remember that particular place in New Zealand, that particular night, that particular comet, as something quite precious.
Yes, the rarity is what makes it precious. That is, only once every 76 years, you better grab it while you can. That's the only time in my life that I've been on the Tasman Glacier, which was a perfect place to see that comet from. If we could do something every day, it would lose its sense of specialness. And since you've mentioned eclipses, I got to see a really long eclipse also. In fact, seeing an eclipse was really my inauguration into the world of journalism. In 1973, I was asked by my college alumni magazine to go to Mauritania and write an article about an eclipse expedition that was led by an astronomer from my university, and it was the second longest eclipse of the millennium, and it was going to be seen best from the Sahara Desert, which is a really hard place to set up camp, and it was above 110 degrees a lot of the time, and there was blowing sand and so on. But in the middle of the Sahara Desert, among all this sand and heat, we got to see this 6-minute, 14-second eclipse. And the fact that it was so rare, second longest of the millennium, and that it was in such a remote place, but the place where its duration would be the longest, the difficulty and rarity of it is what made it special. And I will just never forget the nomads who gathered around our camp during the eclipse and knelt down in the sand and prayed. I'm not a religious person, but that seemed like a very appropriate reaction. It was a sacred moment, and if we had eclipses every day and we could just go out in our backyard, it seems to me that the sacredness would quickly evaporate.
You know, I've had opportunity to visit with a whole lot of people in a near 30-year career doing radio and broadcasting, and I am often amazed at people who describe themselves as not particularly religious, or maybe it's that they would even use the title atheist or however they want to characterize it, and yet they'll speak up for a kind of experience that sometimes they will characterize as spiritual, or even use the word sacred. I know of an astrophysicist who says, I don't have any room in my worldview for God, but the earth is sacred. For those of us who do come from religious backgrounds, that seems kind of mind-blowing. And I'm thinking about you watching the comet from New Zealand and having that moment. I'm tempting you to use the word sacred on that. And is that wrong of me?
No. I especially welcome the label from you because my guess is that you are more religious than I am. And if you feel that it's not inappropriate, I would like to embrace it. And of course, the name of this podcast, Constant Wonder, I would say that my wonder isn't constant, but that feeling of wonder does feel sacred. I feel that nature inspires wonder in me in a way that nothing else quite does. It's just incredibly beautiful. It's perfect. It's infinitely complicated. I don't believe that it was put there for our benefit, but we get to look at it. We get to smell it and touch it and even taste it and listen to it as well as looking at it. So that does feel as close as I'm ever going to come to the experience of the sacred.
Well, the thing about nature, in my experience, is you can't be Pollyannish about it because it can be harsh and dangerous. And the sublime, of course, we know from the history of the Romantics and all the people way before the Romantics. The ancient people knew that the world is red in tooth and claw is one way of putting it. Yeah, there's beautiful flowers, but there's also harsh wind. And you got to cope with those, too.
Yes. This reminds me of my husband's proposal, which was just, I think one of the great proposals of all time. We used to do a lot of backpacking when we were younger, and we were backpacking in the Sierras, September of 1988. We were camped in the Doozy Basin, right beneath the Palisades Peaks, and we decided to take a day trip off trail up some talus and scree to a pass that apparently now has a trail to it, but didn't in those days, called Knapsack Pass. And when we got to the top, George got down on one knee and said, "Will you marry me?" And then a cloud came overhead and the temperature dropped and the wind came up, and then within 15 minutes, and I kid you not, and of course I have a witness downstairs, my husband, who can attest to this very unlikely series of weather events, it rained, and then it snowed, and then it hailed, and then the sun came out again, and then there was a rainbow, an actual rainbow. And George said, "Well, I guess that's what marriage must be like." Well, I think our marriage hasn't been quite as tempestuous as that 15-minute series of weather events, but I like the idea that in a marriage you do go through some ups and downs, and your hope that you're going to end with sun and then a rainbow, and I think in our case we definitely have. And then we went down to our campsite, and we found that our little dome tent, which we hadn't properly secured because it seemed so rigid, it was upside down and kind of bouncing along across the Doozy Basin. And when we got that back, George got out of a backpack a ring that he'd brought on the backpacking trip, but he clearly hadn't been sure that he was going to ask me that day, so he hadn't brought it up to Knapsack Pass, and gave it to me, and I put it on. It looked like sapphires. It turned out to be rhinestones, but it was the best possible engagement ring because of its history. When he was 8, he'd found it on the street in front of his house in Darien, Connecticut, and he thought it was a very valuable ring, and he'd kept it all those years to give to some unknown woman far in the future when he asked her to marry me. And I put it on my finger, and we both looked up at Knapsack Pass, and we were truly engaged.
When Anne and George were parents of young children, there was a Christmas season when they found themselves caught up in that yes to everything enthusiasm that we've heard about in the story of Anne's former student at Yale, Marina.
We lived in New York City when our children were young. We often spent Christmas with my husband's brother, who lives in central Maine. It was too long a drive for our kids to do in one day, so we would stop in a motel about halfway through. And we had a reservation in a motel in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. Henry was a baby. Susanna was around 6. And we got to Sturbridge, and there was just an incredible blizzard that totally upended our plans. The streets weren't plowed. Everything was closed. There was no way that we could get out the next morning and continue our journey. But amazingly, in Sturbridge, there's a little recreation of a colonial New England village, and it was open because it didn't require any electricity. The people who were there kind of making candles and kind of doing all this stuff just didn't require anything. And we were right next to it. And we took the children out. And I remember Susanna breaking off her first icicle and licking it. And it was absolutely magical. We were almost the only people there. It was as if we really had been transported back to colonial New England. And we missed a day of vacation with my husband's brother in Maine, but we got something so much more magical. So the question is, when something like that happens, how capable are you of switching quickly from, all of our plans? Vacation is, now what are we going to do all day? And it's still snowing, do we have the right clothes? And into, whoa, look at the opportunity that has been unexpectedly granted to us.
That's the yes to everything kind of concept in some ways there, I think. I am a person who, when the icicle presents itself, I hesitate to lick it. I've always been kind of a timid soul. People don't think that's true about me, but I am. How do I get to be a little bit more porous or open or willing to do those things?
Well, I think I'm a cautious person myself. I'm the person on the airplane who's wearing a mask when no one else around me is. I'm always the person who, even though my children are in their 30s now, are always telling them to drive carefully. I think I have a lot in common with you, Marcus. But I also think that one of the things we have in common is a capacity for wonder. There is essentially a zero chance you would have a podcast called Constant Wonder unless you were someone who experienced constant wonder. So you may not be licking icicles or kissing birds' eggs, but it seems to me that you lead a life in which you are noticing the world with wonder, and you're also expanding your own capacity for wonder by doing interviews with people who experience wonder in all kinds of different ways, and you can do it vicariously. So I don't think I have any advice for you at all.
To do things vicariously is not a bad thing. I think it actually is a rich opportunity. When you are loving the stories of the South Polar Times, when you're watching your students at a remove during COVID and you're having your Zoom meetings, that distance, in a way, can heighten our attempts to seize on the miraculous or the wondrous in the world. That's kind of it's my conviction. I think it works.
That's my conviction, too.
Anne Fadiman. Her latest book is Frog and Other Essays. We didn't get to the story of the frog. You'll enjoy exploring that one, though, in this lovely collection. Tenery Taylor produced this episode with help from Amelia Scott. Sound design by Gabriel Haro. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.